Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. John, thank you very much for inviting me for this opportunity to return to Melbourne. I wish I could come back more frequently, that's a hint. It's a great city, and to have the privilege to be part of what I think so far has been an extremely interesting and stimulating conference. I'm not going to spend too long talking about the similarities and the differences between local government in the United Kingdom and those in Australia, because my friend and colleague Simon Parker, I thought, dealt with that very well yesterday, though I think he was rather optimistic about both the financial future and more general future of English local government than perhaps I am. I want to draw particularly on my 18 years as a councillor, though I stood down from Bedfordshire County Council, now since abolished, because we have amalgamations and abolitions and mergers, always imposed by central government on us in England in 1999. But I think it gives me a perspective which will resonate with a number of people in this room, which is a political perspective of local government, the role of the councillor. And I think it's very important that we see local government as that partnership between elected representatives, the councillors or mayors, and the officials, chief executives and other staff. And it's, to me, it's that combination, that working together, that actually gives the richness and the opportunity for local government to serve communities. We know, and speaker after speaker have said this throughout this conference, that there's a lot of change about. Previous speakers said, the Greeks were suggesting that, the one constant was going to be change. I think what is happening for those of us in local government, whether we're in Australia or in England, is that change is ever more speedy, ever more influential, and often even more less predictable. And the list I put here could have been much longer. We've got demographic change, but we've got migratory change. We've just heard about technology. How do we embrace technology? And can we embrace technology faster than the population and the businesses within our communities are embracing technology? How are public expectations changing? And are public expectations changing at the same speed at which our ability to respond to those expectations or the money that we have available for them is? So what we've got to learn, and what we've got to be more comfortable with, and it isn't easy for any of us to be comfortable with it seems to me, is to be comfortable working in a period of both change and uncertainty. And I think it's the uncertainty as much as the change that makes for the current contemporary world of local government so worrying, so disturbing, but also potentially so full of opportunity and excitement. As I say, there are contrasts between local government in our two countries. But there are lots of differences. There are lots of differences in terms of legal competencies, size, population, sparsity of population, geography. I recall speaking 2 years ago at the Queensland LGA conference, and at the dinner the night before the conference, talking to a mayor of a rural, probably a resource, I now learned today, probably a resource council, and I said, how big is your area? He said about the geography of Wales, with a population of about 4,000 or 5,000. Very difficult for me to compute that, thinking about the London borough in which I work, which has a population of nearly 400,000. Within 20 minutes I could walk from one end of that borough to the other, and I'm not a particularly fast walker. So in a sense, there are some enormous contrasts between local authorities. But we also have things in common. We have a common language, just about. I used that phrase once when I spoke in the United States, and certainly it's even less just about. And we occasionally, but we have very different abilities at sport. I'm certainly looking forward to going to the Ashes series in the summer. And I'm not predicting who's going to win because I want to have some friends before I leave Australia. But also, I'm the climate. There are differences, there are similarities. But fundamentally, we have local communities, we have local economies, we have children who need to be educated and looked after, we have elderly people who need care, we have streets that need to be cleaned, we have businesses that need to be supported and nurtured. So we have more in common, it seems to me, than we have differences. And I think what I've heard in the last 24 hours has been so encouraging, and I hope I reflected it in the piece I wrote for The Guardian in advance of leaving England and anticipating what I would hear, that I think I've heard a great deal of optimism and confidence. I've actually seen and heard and felt more confidence in this audience than I do when I speak and work with local authorities across England, or indeed across the United Kingdom. So I think in a sense you are more confident, and I think you are, and certainly this summit personifies it, looking to the future and being more strategic, that often we feel when we're beleaguered and we're looking inwardly. We've got a lot of strengths. Our biggest strength is that we are local government. We're not local administration. It can often feel as if we're local administration, because it can feel we've been told what to do, in your case by state and federal level, in our case by national level. But we are local government. Councillors get elected, people put their ballot papers in the same ballot boxes as they put for members of the state parliament or the federal parliament. Just remember that, in a sense, the legitimacy is there, and actually, in a sense, closer. We have a democratic mandate. No other organisation working in a locality has that mandate. There are many organisations which have a very close affinity, relationship, accountability to communities, particularly in the voluntary community sector, other agencies of the state. But we have that direct relationship through the ballot box with our constituents and with our localities. And in the city of Melbourne, I understand that it includes also businesses as well as residents. And councillors live in, come from, and represent their communities. Someone once said to me, one of the problems with councillors is, you know, they don't go through a formal assessment process before they get recruited. And we can get people of all kinds of intelligence and thinking. And I said, well, actually, that's great, isn't it? Because communities are like that. And we want people who are going to represent the communities. We want to reflect the communities in terms of ethnicity, gender mix, age mix. And we don't often succeed, certainly on age mix in England. I don't know how well you do here. We tend to be older rather than younger. We are the leader of our place. And it seems to me this is the great role that local government has to play. To lead and shape the place. What do we want our town, our place, our city, our rural area to look like? What do we want its balance of its economy to be? What do we want the opportunities for young people to be? How do we want citizens to work and live together? And that's a role, it seems to me, for local government to facilitate. It's not always to do, because we don't have the power or the competence. It may not even be appropriate to do it ourselves, but how do we shape and influence what others are doing? How are we going to support and nurture businesses in our area? Because without businesses, without economic growth, we probably don't have much of a future, and the voluntary and community sector. And we're also a voice upwards and sideways and downwards, however you want to look at it, to other parts of government. How do we ensure, and someone talked about political clout in an earlier presentation, that we can use that democratic mandate that we have for our place to say, this is what is necessary, State of Victoria, State of Queensland, Northern Territories, Whitehall departments in our case, this is what you need to do to support our area. How do we do that and bring that together? And I think that's difficult in a, because there'll be members of parliament, there'll be state politicians, there'll be state governments, there'll be saying that's actually our role, and that's a challenge. So what matters most, it seems to be for place, is what matters most for people who live in that place. Not what matters most for the council. The council is there to ensure that people have a decent, good place to live, that they have social and economic well-being, they have optimism, they have hope, they have opportunity. How do we contribute, and Simon talked about this very much in the English context yesterday, increasingly how do we as local authorities facilitate growth, through our planning processes, how do we get the right balance between always conceding what business community wants in terms of planning with what actually residents want? What's right to actually sustain, a good, green, open place that we want to live in, but we also want to have business. We don't just want big office blocks everywhere. How do we get the right balance of economic growth? Because, I've seen local authorities feeling very pleased that they've granted major planning permission for major international companies to come and locate in England, and to find, as a consequence, they've got half a dozen new jobs, and those were people who moved from Rome or Paris or from New York to come and populate them. So actually, again, it's about how do we have to build up our indigenous businesses as well. How do we have sustainable and cohesive communities? And we heard a lot from Peter yesterday about the importance of community, the importance of neighbourhood, where we have some solidarity between ourselves, where there is self-help in communities, not for the local government, it seems to me, to interfere and stop that, and often not to even to engineer it and create it, but to create the conditions in which people will be more self-help, there'll be more community activity, and people will respect each other. And in times of tension, the role to ensure that there is social cohesion, not comfort, not complacency, but people respect each other. And I think local government has a leadership role to play in that. We heard about equity earlier on from one of the speakers. How do we ensure fairness and equity and equality and opportunity for all? Because it's very easy, and I was thinking of this when we looked at participatory budget yesterday, very important, but we can't just always go for the most populist solutions, because there are minority interests that we may have a statutory responsibility for, we certainly have a moral responsibility to support. How do we create the difference of our place, but ensuring that difference is consistent, that our place can play a role in the wider regional or national or global place? In the United Kingdom, the media have a lovely phrase, postcode lottery. It's outrageous, says the tabloid newspaper, that services in Plymouth in the southwest of England are different to the services in Newcastle in the northeast, and the outcomes of services are different. I would respond by saying, because actually needs are different, choices and aspirations are different. Local people must make local choices. It's democratic choice. And ironically, some of our most centralised services in England, and we most certainly have them, we have a National Health Service which is very top-down run. Health outcomes are significantly different in different parts of the country from a centralised arrangement. Educational outcomes, which up until recently were much more locally influenced, are far less distributed. So that leadership of place, setting the vision, setting the strategic objectives for the place, not on your own, talking to people, listening to people, getting the views of businesses, of residents, of voluntary organisations, of community groups, ensuring excellent service outcomes. We talk a lot about commissioning in England, and I know you do here too. And often we conflate commissioning with procurement. To me, commissioning is about working through with people and with other stakeholders what are the needs of our community. How can those needs best be met, and how can we match the limited resources we've got to allocate those resources? We might want to support the voluntary sector to deliver services. Certainly a growing fashion, and I think of one I would support back at home. But if you want voluntary organisations to deliver services, you've got to support them and build their capacity. You've got to procure on the terms that enable them to do it. Often, we say we want a greater role for the third sector, and we go out for a procurement, and unless you're a multinational company with a balance sheet, you can fund the bond to take the contract on, actually you're excluded, so we don't get that right. It may be about procuring services and contracting them from external providers, from the voluntary sector or the private sector. It may be through in-house provision. And I think we're going to see a greater pluralism of service provision. But what matters to us as councillors and councils, it seems to me, is that we're getting the right outcomes in a way which are affordable and delivered in a way that has the right values and the right environmental approach that's going to support our area. It's about working and collaborating with others, and we've heard a lot about that today. But it will be about collaborating with others in the state organisations that are working in your locality, collaborating with businesses, collaborating with your neighbouring authorities. And it's enabling others to do. And what's the role, therefore, of a councillor? It seems to me, and I appreciate that in Victoria and indeed in Australia more generally, local government is probably not as party political as it is in England, where virtually every local authority, councillors are elected on a party ticket. I was going to say for one of the three major parties after what happened 2 weeks ago, one of the four aspirant major parties. I think it's very important for councillors to have two roles. One is to be the ward representative, the community organiser, the person in the community working with their neighbours, listening to their neighbours, facilitating, helping, supporting. But at the same time, in the council office, council chamber, it's been strategic. It's about setting that vision. It's about ensuring the authority is moving in the right direction and knowing where you want to be. It's been about value driven. So your electorate know that you've got the right values and you've got the right principles, and those are the values and principles, but presumably, I've done it in the past, we put it into our manifesto. It's sometimes easier, sometimes more difficult to execute if you've got a party badge, because people sort of think, if you're a Labour Party, you've got a certain values, and if you're a Conservative or a National Party or a Liberal Party, you're going to have certain values, and that may be easier. But be value driven and hold tight to your values, but hold tight to being a politician, because there's nothing disrespectful about being a politician. You're not managers. So often I have seen councillors who become administrators and managers wanting to, we employ the managers to do the management. We've got to keep that political vision, really listening to and being the conduit for the community, and therefore being focused on outcomes. And it's working with others. A good councillor will know the faith groups in his or her community. They will work with the voluntary and community sector in their community. They won't seek to control them. They will respect they have different roles. They may at times disagree, but they will respect each other in doing that. And above all, you've got to cooperate and collaborate with your fellow councillors. And that means across the political divide sometimes as much as it does within the political divide. And I have to say, in my experience of my 18 years as a councillor, nearly 10 of those as a group leader, 8 of them as a council leader, sometimes the divisions within your group are more difficult to work across than the divisions across working with your opponents. I think I would say privately, and if I can in this public room, it was sometimes easier to manage the authority when we were a minority group than when we were never actually majority, but we were one time almost a majority, because it was sometimes easier to do deals with colleagues in other groups. And it's important too to appoint the right senior staff and hold those staff to account. Not to hire and fire in the way that most English football clubs, with the exception of Manchester United and Arsenal, do, sort of weekly. And luckily councils aren't yet run by Russian oligarchs, are they, who would probably be dismissing their managers and their chief executives halfway through a council meeting if something didn't quite go wrong. Because actually, if you only come second in the English Championship League, the football manager, you now get sacked, but that's just not good enough. So we've got to have some realism in the way we hold to account and performance manage. But we've got to get the right appointments and hold those managers to account. And I think the role of council managers, therefore, is to see through the delivery of what councillors want, but help and advise the councillors to make the right decisions. And again, that relationship, to me, the most successful councils I know is where the relationship between the mayor or the chief officer is best, or between the leader and the chief executive really works. They know each other's boundaries, they know how to work together, they respect each other, they know they have different roles and work in that way. And councils themselves must be more strategic. And you've got to have an architecture for working with others. We are very good at over-engineering architecture. I could have put a slide up here that looks like the most incredible bit of sort of cat's knitting, or a cobweb spiral of partnership architecture, which is common in most English local authority areas. But we do need to know who our partners are and how we're going to work with them. We've got to learn to gain what we want to do by influence, persuasion, negotiation, and using our political mandate, our political capital, but you can overuse it, you can't use it time and time again, to persuade others to work and behave in different ways, including the public to behave in different ways. You can't always do it through control. And I think too often, both managerially and politically, I've seen local authorities where we've tried to control rather than seek to influence and persuade. And I think that's a skill and an approach we've got to get much better at. We've got to be better at strategic commissioning. And I think you strategic commission if you've got in-house services, because you've got to know what you want, what outcomes you want, how much you want to spend on that particular activity, and how you would know whether you've achieved the right outcomes for that expenditure. And where we've got in-house services, we need to do those in an exemplar way. We can't say, well, because these are council directly managed services, it doesn't really matter if they're not so good, and we're not going to hold them to account in the way we would do if it's a company or a charity running them. Or, because actually it's all in the family. We've got to be very clear, because money's tight, and we've got to be able to demonstrate every pound or every dollar we spend is effectively spent in getting the right outcomes. But when we procure from the private sector or the third sector, there's no reason why, and I don't know precisely what your procurement legislation is, I know what the European Union procurement legislation is like, which is what public procurement in the United Kingdom is subject to, rather than domestic legislation. But there's no reason why you can't set social goals, local economic goals, whether it's local labour, local supply, standards of employment practice, diversity targets, environmental standards, on your private sector providers as much as you would do on your in-house providers, and expect the same level of transparency and accountability. We have a Freedom of Information Act. It doesn't currently apply in the United Kingdom to private contractors. I think it will do, if in due course. There's a lot of pressure for it. But if organisations are spending, some of our contractors, literally billions of public money, they should be as accountable and as transparent as the public sector is. And I think we've got to hold them to account in that way. And we've got to become better at that method. So we've got to have a new settlement for local government. And I'm hearing a lot about that today in the course and in the communique which you're going to debate and vote on. Great introduction for all the speakers. As John keeps saying, this exciting thing is going to come at 3 o'clock. So we're thinking, well, we're just a warm-up act for a day and a half until you get on to the voting. Really looking forward to seeing that voting later. But I think that new settlement is about community. It's about how do we make vibrant, sustainable communities, economically, socially, environmentally sustainable. How do we build a resilient civil society where people are participating as citizens, active citizens, as well as recipients of services and users of services? I've talked about the pluralism of supply. I don't think we should be wedded to one form of supply. What we should be wedded to is value for money, achieving social value. We now have in England and in Wales, but not in the rest of the United Kingdom, a legal obligation on local authorities and other public bodies when procuring to take into account social value as much as value for money. It's a very new piece of legislation. It's going to be interesting to see how it gets tested. I don't think the legislation itself matters. I think what it matters, it signals a new form of behaviour. That when we're spending public money, we want to get public value, public and social outcomes, as much as we want to get economic outcomes or service outcomes. I think there's going to be a variety of service delivery. In Australia, as there's going to be in England. In-house, local authorities setting up trading companies, shared services. We've heard a lot about shared services in the course of this conference. It's working with, in different ways, with the private sector. But one of the things we are seeing in England, and I think this is something just as a sort of salutary reflection for you, when in 2010 a right-of-centre government got elected, committed to major reductions in public expenditure, greater in local government than in any other sector, it there was an expectation that we would see a rush to outsource to the private sector. Traditionally, the private sector has played a role to take out costs. We had something called compulsory competitive tendering. It was a legacy of Mrs. Thatcher's, which made local authorities and other parts of the public sector had to put services out to tender. They had, unless they had very good reason, to always award it to the lowest tender. And if they didn't, the central government intervened and instructed you. I was very proud as a council leader, had several Section 113 notices with over the notices which told me I'd made the wrong procurement decision and I had to reverse it. I wanted quality rather than the lowest price on things like school meals. It seemed to me it was important for the welfare of the children. We got the right quality, not just the cheapest price, but we weren't allowed to. But what we are seeing is that we haven't seen that surge towards greater outsourcing. Why? One, the view is that actually the results are quite mixed. Two, it takes time. You know, an average big local authority procurement will take 2 years in England. That's a lot of cost. It's a lot of opportunity cost for senior managers negotiating when they could be doing things internally. It's a huge cost too for the bidding organisations, who of course will recharge on subsidy contracts. And in a period of uncertainty, what political leader or mayor or chief executive or finance director wants to lock up another large chunk of their budget in an inflexible contract, because it means that's a bit of budget you can't touch. And it may actually be you don't know what services you want in the next period. So why do you want to lock in to a 5-7 year contract? And I think we've got to find new ways of working between the sectors through collaborative working rather than that more formal contracting arrangement. We're seeing some interest, much slower I think than some would expect or want in England, to see the development of cooperative social enterprises, staff within public services forming cooperatives and spinning out, as the term is, being given the right to take their service with them and then contract back to the public sector. And there'll be permutations of those. I don't think there's one answer, and there's certainly no right answer. What matters is what matters for your community. It's a matter about you getting the right value and the right outcomes. It's about using your assets in the most constructive, most profitable way. Because don't forget, you own a lot of property, and I think sometimes we forget the assets we use, and we don't use those assets the way a commercial organisation would do to get inward investment to actually make those assets work for our communities. And we've got to have proper accountability and transparency, and we've got to have effective governance, irrespective of how we're delivering our services. And it can, as someone said earlier, be more difficult to get effective governance if you've got a range of contracted services than it is if you've got them in-house. And these are matters I think are rightly to take into account in terms of your relationship. So my conclusion is that Australia is different to England, but there are differences within Australia too. There are different climates within Australia, both social and economic as well as in terms of the weather. And you need to reflect those. And the richness of local government is its ability to reflect those. The fact the solution in one locality is going to be different to a locality we may look to all intents and purposes very similar. But actually, people have different choices and want different ends. So it's about localism. It's about place. So my final point, my final message would be, actually, like a good vintage wine, you need to nurture local government. You need to treat it with care. Don't lock it away in a dark cellar, though, at 13 degrees, or whatever you do with wine, for many decades. What the French would do with wine for many decades to make it mature. So we actually want to be able to drink it now as well as in the future. But what we've got to be absolutely fearless. We've got to be bold. We've got to be courageous. We've got to be willing to challenge vested interest and orthodoxy. We've got to be ready to be uncomfortable, ready occasionally to take unpopular decisions, if that's in the best interest of the place and the people who have elected us. If we're not willing to do that, I challenge this audience, and I challenge local government more generally, whether it's in Australia, in the United Kingdom, the United States, or anywhere else, Why are you there? What right do you have to call yourself government? What right do you have to say, we represent our place, we have a democratic mandate, if we're not ready to use that mandate? And that means we have to be ready to challenge upwards to state and federal level when we believe those legislatures are not working in the best interest of our place. But we also have to be ready to concede, challenge our communities and organisations within our communities as well to change. Because if we don't, who is going to shape the place that you, I, our children and grandchildren are going to live in? Our role is to be custodians of place today and for future generations. Thank you.
We've got time for a few questions of John.
Thanks, John. Chris Meadows Taylor from the Coalfields in Central Victoria. You raised a proposition that I think few would disagree, that councillors should ideally represent both have strategic capability, but also be focused on the neighbourhood representation issues. And I think that's a given for most of us. The reality, however, I put to you is that balance is often not as easy to find as we would like, and those capabilities don't lie next to each other as easy as they should. And to raise, I get your response on that, and particularly Graham Sampson's proposal in his report in the New South Wales reform, which I think is very, very interesting, and that is councils of a certain size, as I understand it, might actually think is a way ahead, or a model might be having a mix of strategic-based councillors selected on that ability, as well as the traditional ward neighbourhood approach. And even if the how of that may take some thinking, that raises, in my mind, I think, a very exciting and interesting proposition. So just interested on your take on those issues.
I think you're right. Getting that balance is extremely difficult. When I first got elected in 1981 to Bedfordshire County Council, there were 83 councillors, so rather bigger than I think many of your authorities. And when I became leader of my group 3 years later, and there were 31 of our group then, the vast majority, I think, wanted to be neither strategic nor wanted to be active in their wards, which is a bit of a challenge. They wanted to come to meetings and, take part in meetings and make decisions that weren't very strategic. And I think there is something about the calibre. And because we have a party system, and everyone is elected on a party system, there is some responsibility there on the parties to actually get, do some pre-selection of candidates. More difficult when you don't have parties. I think there are members who are naturally ward activists. People who become councillors because they've actually been active in a voluntary organisation or in their church group or in the parent-teacher association or whatever it may be, and this is a natural extension. So they feel comfortable. Others who want to be much more strategic. And you sometimes have to combine the two. The way that I had to combine the two was, I won a seat in 81, which my party had never held before, or for living memory. It was marginal in the 4 elections I had to fight it. So I could go up to County Court and be strategic and be leader and talk, about multi-million-pound deals and all the rest of it. I knew if I wasn't active in my ward, I wouldn't get re-elected. And that, I think, put some tension on it. So there's something about that relationship. One of the things I didn't talk about, which I was really interested in terms of the New South Wales report, is parish or town councils. And most of our rural parts of England have parish or town councils. Parish councils in the rural areas, town councils typically in the large villages, small market towns say up to 10, 15,000 population. And we are seeing some parts of urban areas now have urban councils which are equivalent, which are much more focused on neighbourhood, often with some dual membership but not exclusively. I think that can play a big role too. I'm slightly sceptical, I think, of electing councillors as strategy councillors as opposed to electing generic councillors. I think for two reasons. One is I think you do need, even if you're strategic, to be grounded in your community as a neighbourhood councillor. Secondly, I think you actually want some of the tension, because actually part of the game is competition within the council about who's going to get onto the senior committees and senior roles. What we have had, and we referred to the earlier presentation, to directly elected mayors, which is clear, more strategic role. We've got, I think, about 15 currently in England. I may be wrong, give or take one or two. It's sort of become less popular. But they can clearly play a more strategic role, because not the Mayor of London, that's a completely different role and completely different powers to mayors of an authority. So I think it's always going to be a tension, but part of it has to be about helping members, supporting them, and member development too. We haven't talked a lot about member development, but I think that's very important. And really the expectations prior to election. Sorry, rather a long way round, saying I think it is a tension, I think it always will be a tension. Maybe it's not such a bad tension if we recognise it's there and work it through.